If you're having trouble priming your pool pump and it's a new pump that you're installing, what I would typically think is the problems that I would try first. First things first, as with the last video on priming your pump, just keep repeating that process. Add water to the chamber at least 3 to 5 times. Let it run at least 3 minutes every time you do that. A lot of times when you install a pump for the first time, it just needs that extra little bit of water to get going. And it's not uncommon, and it's not something that's indicative of it being a long-term problem. Just that's normal for new pumps. That's why this video is different than if you had an existing pump, because there's kind of a different set of circumstances that you're going to explore when troubleshooting why a new pump won't prime. One of the most common when you install a new pump is that there could be something wrong with the electrical connection. The instructions for installing electrical on pool pumps are not exactly clear. In fact, they're kind of vague on purpose, because I don't believe that the manufacturers want to accept liability for it being done wrong. Basically what they do, in almost from every manufacturer, is say have your pump connected by a qualified professional licensed electrician, which is a good idea. That's definitely a good idea. But just a little bit of background info: when you get a pump from a manufacturer, most pumps, depending on the size, are either going to be able to be used on 220 or 110 volts of power. And if that's the case, if that's the kind of pump that you have, then there's usually a little selector switch inside of the electrical connection area, the junction box on the back of the motor. And that selector switch you need to connect for either 110 volts or 220 volts. From the manufacturer, it's coming at 220 volts. They're assuming that you're going to apply 220 volts of power to this motor. And a lot of times that's not the case, especially if you've been doing it yourself as opposed to hiring an electrician. Maybe that's an indication that it's more likely you have 110 volts available. A lot of people, if you're not an electrician and you're not familiar with electrical connections, tend to shy away from 220 volts more so than 110, which is definitely a good idea. If you don't know about electricity, you shouldn't have anything to do with it, especially when you're talking about a pool pump, something that's going to be used around water. It's a heavy draw appliance. There's a lot to know. So if you don't know what you're doing, definitely don't do it. But if you wired up your new pump and you turn on the pump and you can hear it just doesn't sound like the old pump, it sounds quiet, it's not really revving up, then it could be that you've just supplied 110 volts power to a 220 volt pump. And the reason why the manufacturer sends them all like that, wired for 220, is because if you were to supply 110 volts of power to a pump ready for 220 volts, nothing happens. The pump just doesn't run properly. I mean, it would probably damage it long term if you were to just leave it like that, but you'd notice that it's not operating and turn it off. Nothing's wrong with the pump. If they all came wired for 110 volts and half the people who hook them up wire them to 220 volts, well, you probably just blew that motor. And that's why they do that. So if your pump won't prime and it's a new installation, does it sound right? Are you certain that you've got the correct electrical supply going to the pump? Don't just switch them around if you don't know, because you can and will break your pump. You need to be familiar with how to use a voltmeter. You need to know how to make safe electrical terminations, and it's one of those things, just get an electrician if you don't know. If I could still not prime the pump and I was confident with everything so far, the next thing I would do is check all the gaskets and O-rings associated with the pump, starting with the pump lid. The pump lid gasket, the first time it goes in place, maybe it kind of got pinched underneath the lid or something like that and there's a flat spot. Pull it out, inspect it, grease it with a lubricant that is not petroleum based, so no Vaseline, for example. You want to use a silicone based lubricant that's not going to degrade that rubber over time. So grease the O-ring, put it back on, again fill the pump chamber with water, start it up, try it again. If that's still not solving anything, then I would look towards the pipe connections that you've made. Nowadays there's really two styles. There's the female thread, so you would use a male adapter to thread into it with a thread sealant such as Teflon tape or silicone or both, hopefully not epoxy or anything else petroleum based. Again, petroleum based thread sealants like pipe dope, that's a really common one. Use that in the plumbing industry, but you shouldn't use that on swimming pool plumbing equipment because it's almost all PVC and CPVC, and that pipe dope expands over time as it ages, and eventually it'll crack the manifold that you're threading into. So instead of costing yourself a new pump or new filter, definitely stay away from pipe dope altogether. there. The two most common are Teflon tape, if you know how to use it, and 100% waterproof silicone, not acrylic caulk. It has to be silicone, 100% waterproof silicone. So those are the two best options if you have the threaded connections. So check there. If you've made a mess of those threaded connections, then your pump could be pulling a ton of air through those, and it wouldn't prime. So that's something that you're going to need to take a look at. Nowadays, also, a lot of pumps are coming with union connectors. So basically, all you do is you just glue right into the front of your pump. And if that's the case, I mean, it's harder to mess up a glue connection. You'd know if you didn't get it right, or if you did, most likely, because you can see it. You can see that there's gaps in the glue and things like that. You might hear a hiss. Most common, if I had to say that there was a leak somewhere on the suction side of the pump on a new installation, I would say it's on the O-ring that's on the union. So a lot of times, as I was saying, there's a union connection that you glue into. We'll spin that union open and inspect the O-ring. There should be an O-ring inside of there. And when you reconnect it, make sure that it's not getting pinched or displaced or anything like that. If it looks or feels dry, then again, use the silicone-based lubricant and see if you can't improve the connection. And I guess the last thing that I would look at, and I mean, it stands to reason that it would be the last thing that you look at. If you've tried everything else and you can't get your new pump installation to work, start with the simple stuff. Go right back at the beginning of the suction line. You might have closed some valves while you were preparing to disconnect the old pump, and maybe you forgot to open those valves. Especially if you have three-way Jandy valves, something like that, or three-way diverter valves. You might have it set to the wrong side, or you might just have ball valves closed, and you need to open them up because the pump can't run if it doesn't have access to the water in your pool. And so if I had a new pump, those are all the things that I'd look at to solve an issue where I couldn't get it to prime after a new installation.